Welcome to the Global News Podcast from the BBC. Hello, I'm Oliver Conway. And today we're joined by our correspondent Bernd Debusmann in Washington. And Bernd, we're talking to you today because the Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu is in town at a time when relations are strained. How would you characterise the current state of the relationship between the US and Israel?
Well, even though President Trump is very quick to say that he's Israel's best friend that they've ever had in Washington, it's quite clear that that relationship's come increasingly under strain, in particular because of the conflict in Iran. It's no longer clear that the U.S. and Israel are on the same page. There's been quite a lot of concern, even from other Republicans, about the perception that there wasn't any daylight between Trump and Netanyahu. Some, including in President Trump's base, have increasingly been under the impression that Israel dragged the U.S. into this war, which was never very popular with Americans. So it is also politically expedient for President Trump to kind of present a little distance between him and Prime Minister Netanyahu. But it's quite clear things are much more perhaps tense now than they were when Operation Epic Fury began back in February.
Now, some of the strongest criticism has actually come from the Democrats. There was a recent vote where more than 100 of them in the House of Representatives voted to cut off aid to Israel. Now, that didn't pass, but just a few years ago, that kind of thing would have been unthinkable. What's going on?
Well, this is a kind of a shift in perceptions we started to see back in 2023 when the war in Gaza began. Among many Democrats, there was a huge exasperation that President Biden at the time didn't cut military aid to Israel in light of the civilian casualties that were mounting very, very quickly in Gaza. And it's become something that's really become quite an emotional and powerful issue for many voters, particularly many Democrats. And I think we're starting to see that reflected by Democratic lawmakers on Capitol Hill, that they no longer want to necessarily be seen as being a close ally to Israel or someone who's extending a helping hand to Israel financially or militarily because of the war in Gaza and more recently because of the war in Iran. Many Democrats also share that view that Israel kind of helped convince President Trump to launch this war, which among Democrats is extremely unpopular. And I think now we're starting to see lawmakers for their own political future kind of turn their backs on Israel a bit. And that's something we've seen increasingly since October of 2023.
Yeah, some top Democrats, including possible presidential contenders, California Governor Gavin, Newsom, Senator Cory, have said they will refuse money from the pro-Israel lobbying group AIPAC. Now, for those who don't know, just tell us what AIPAC is and what do you make of that stand taken by those Democrats?
Well, AIPAC is essentially a lobbying organization that works to promote ties between the U.S. and Israel, and it's something that's been enormously influential in the past. They throw quite a lot of money around in elections for candidates that they see as being pro-Israel or someone who would help make Israel's case on Capitol Hill and to the White House. And that's something that's kind of been a fact of U.S. politics for many, many decades. That started coming under much more scrutiny after the war in Gaza began as well. And in some Democratic circles, particularly in the kind of far left of the party, it became kind of something of a black mark to be seen as taking money from an organization that is promoting Israeli interest in the United States. I think now, as I mentioned, it's become something that to many voters, particularly young voters, they don't like necessarily to see their candidate having any sort of campaign contribution that they see that they would then have to do something for with regards to Israel. Of course, AIPAC has pushed back strongly on all these suggestions that it's somehow an extension of Israel's government, but that idea has been out there, and I think especially once images of the war in Gaza started coming out, it's something that voters began to scrutinize a little more, and many lawmakers are keenly aware of that and don't necessarily want that perception around them, particularly going into any sort of midterm or election season.
You mentioned younger voters. Is this a generational shift? Because we saw a very different attitude from the then President Joe Biden after Israel was attacked back on the 7th of October?
Well, polls show very clearly that there is a huge generational shift in perceptions about Israel. Many older Americans are more likely to view Israel favorably and view U.S. contributions to Israel, whether financially or militarily, as a good thing, whereas younger voters skew very much the other way. The last poll I saw in that regard, there was a 20-point difference between younger voters and older voters about whether or not they view Israel positively. And that's something that I think especially the younger edge of voters that have come of age in the last several years, or perhaps kind of in the just before they turned 18 and could vote, were presented with the images of what was happening in Gaza. Those are voters that are very strongly against Israel's government. Now you're seeing kind of younger candidates as well. I think Zohran Mamdani in New York is a great example who represent to many people that worldview that Israel is not necessarily America's friend. So I think that really does present a very long-term challenge to Israel, because it's no longer clear that that support that has been ironclad for decades, really since kind of Israel's inception, that won't necessarily be the case in the next few years. And I think that really has changed the dynamic of the U.S.-Israeli relationship as it's seen here in Washington.
Now, there was some suggestion during the last presidential election that the Gaza issue had an impact, at least in the state of Michigan. Could Israel-US relations affect upcoming elections, the midterm and then the next presidential election?
Well, both yes and no. Polls show that when it comes to Americans headed to the ballot box to vote, foreign policy really isn't the top thing on their minds. They're much more concerned with the economy and their daily finances. I think, for example, in the upcoming midterms, one issue that many Americans will have number one in their minds is the issue of rising petrol prices because of the war in Iran. That, of course, in the minds of many, is something that's tied to Israel and that perception that I've mentioned of Israel kind of dragging the U.S. into this war. At the same time, there are younger voters for which this is perhaps the biggest foreign policy issue. And I think in combination, it really could be a factor. Certainly in the upcoming midterms, as this is all still very fresh in everyone's mind, but U.S. ties with Israel is something that comes up in presidential debates every 4 years, and I suspect, given the events of the last few years, it'll very much play a prominent role in the foreign policy discussions once Americans head to elect a new president, even if it's still kind of somewhat far behind the economy in terms of what people are thinking about when they head to those polls.
Now, we talked about the Democrats. Is this also a difficult issue for some Republicans? Certainly, we've seen some debates in the right-wing podosphere, as it were.
Indeed, and I think particularly within that core Make America Great Again MAGA base of President Trump, there's much more split opinion about Israel than was the case in the past. Earlier in this administration, just a few months ago, we saw the head of the National Counterterrorism Center, Joe Kent, who was something of a MAGA darling. He resigned from his position because, in his view, Israel tricked the United States into joining this conflict. And I think that's a perception that's now shared among some of the more conservative members of the MAGA base. There's also many people within that MAGA base that are against foreign aid and military aid and sending money overseas and weapons overseas, full stop, including to Israel. And Israel is the largest recipient of U.S. military aid. So I think there is very much a split between that MAGA base and Republicans such as the late Lindsey Graham, who was really an outspoken supporter of Israel and someone who was seen as very close to Israel on Capitol Hill. There's a very visible split within Republicans over Israel.
Bernd, thank you. Bernd Debusmann there in Washington. If you'd like to hear more from the Global News Podcast, click the link below. Thanks for watching.